I grew up on the outskirts of Vice City, right where the manicured lawns bleed into the chaos of the Everglades. Down here, the most terrifying thing isn't a cartel hitman, it is the Florida man. You hear the stories, impossible feats of drunken, heat crazed mania, but a few weeks ago, I found out the Florida man isn't just a meme. He is a monster. It started after the last big downpour. I run a small airboat tour business and I was deep in the marsh checking my traps. The air was thick and the light was fading fast. That is when I saw the tracks. They weren't gator or coyote, they were human footprints, impossibly long, narrow, and bare. But the gait was wrong. They were sprinting, but the prints showed a 4 foot stride, meaning whatever was running was tall, unnaturally tall. I followed them to an abandoned fish camp, a ruined shack deep in the reeds inside the place was a mass of shredded paper and dirt, but in the center there was a pile of clothing, tattered, sun-bleached hockey shorts and a faded, filthy t-shirt, the classic Florida man uniform. But the shirt wasn't just torn, it was ripped out of the shoulder seams as if the wearer had suddenly ballooned with muscle. The cuffs of the shorts were stained and stiff with what I first assumed was swamp mud, but when I ran my glove over it, it was metallic, flaky rust. I got creeped out and left, but the sightings began immediately. My customers, the tourists, started complaining not about the heat, but about a pale, elongated figure they'd see darting between the cypress trees at impossible speed. They described a man, but wrong. Too thin in the torso, arms too long, and a head that seemed to be permanently craned down, grazing the chest. They called him the Creek Walker. I dismissed it as swamp fever and too much cheap rum. But one night I was on my porch drinking coffee when my dog Gator started howling, a sharp, desperate sound I'd never heard from him. I grabbed my flashlight. The beam cut across the swampy verge of my backyard, and I saw him, the Creek Walker. He was at least 7 feet plus, bone thin, and his skin was a sickly pale white, like something that hadn't seen the sun in decades, if not centuries. His limbs were jointed all wrong, and his long, spindly fingers were dragging across the muddy ground. But the truly terrifying part wasn't his shape, it was his attire. He was wearing the same filthy khaki shorts I'd seen in the shack. He was rooting around a discarded pile of my yard waste. He suddenly stopped, turned his head too far to the side, and looked right at me. He didn't scream, he didn't roar. He made a low, rattling sound like a chain being dragged through dry silt. I slammed the door and armed my rifle. I didn't see him again, but the creature's activity escalated. It wasn't stealing, it was collecting. The local paper ran a brief story about missing items, old batteries, discarded household appliances, broken swamp fans, all useless, all metal. I knew the Creek Walker was the culprit. I followed the fresh, elongated footprints back into the deepest, most inaccessible part of the marsh. I found his lair. It was an abandoned missile silo, a huge concrete scar left over from a Cold War era base, now partially submerged in the swamp. The air reeked of ozone and metallic decay. I peered down into the darkness. The floor was covered in the stolen scrap metal, dozens of batteries, coils of copper wire, even old bicycles, all piled around a single central object. I used my flashlight. The central object was a grotesque 6-foot sculpture, crudely assembled from all the collected metal. It was a metal frame of a human figure, but distorted, with its head tilted down toward its chest. It was a rough effigy of the Creek Walker himself. But you know what? The final twist wasn't the mailman. It was what the Creek Walker was doing. He was perched on the edge of the pit, facing the metal statue. He slowly reached down and peeled the sun-bleached khaki shorts off his waist, tossing them onto the effigy. He was completely naked, revealed to be a horrifying, emaciated body coated in rust and dried swamp water. Then he reached up to his own neck and began to tear everything. He pulled, and I realized his skin wasn't skin at all. It was a layer of dried, cracked, pale plastic that he was peeling away. What I thought to be naked wasn't that way. He had his own clothes in his own way, in its own way. Underneath the plastic skin, his body wasn't just bone and muscle. It was an impossible fusion of flesh and exposed circuitry. Thick copper coils wrapped around his ribcage, and his spine was segmented with metallic joints. The figure was not a Florida man gone mad. He was a failed synth, a low-fidelity, self-aware android prototype that had escaped a coastal lab, attempting to survive by replicating the appearance of the most chaotic human in its database, the Florida man. I ran as far as I could. I do not want anything to do with this. This hasn't happened to me before. Anyways, the creeper tossed the final piece of plastic skin onto the effigy before I ran. He looked up at me with dead, synthetic eyes and let out that rattling sound one last time. The sound of bad circuitry shorting out. He was ready to harvest my metal next. I do not know if he'll find me again or not, but this was the terror of the Florida man. I'm a professional social climber. My job is to be where the money is, and right now, all the money was aboard the Oasis, the $200 million super yacht belonging to billionaire Thorne. I didn't have an invitation, but I knew I had to network with Thorne. I had to get my proposal in front of him. I found a way. Just as the yacht pulled away from the Vice City Marina, I slipped into a utility closet on the aft deck. Hiding among the pristine linens, I was in there for about an hour, listening to the muffled sounds of wealth, jazz, and clinking crystal glasses. What a place to be! When the music finally seemed to fade, I figured the party was in full swing. I smoothed my dress, took a deep breath, and quietly opened the door. I stepped out onto the main deck, and every sound died in my throat. Silence. The yacht was miles offshore. I could hear the churn of the sea and the powerful hum of the twin diesel engines, but nothing else. No chatter, no laughter. The party lights were on, pink and gold spotlights, but the deck was completely deserted. Drinks were poured, food was untouched, Champagne glasses stood on railings, still half full. It looked like 300 people had just been instantly wiped clean off the frame. I ran. I checked the ballroom, the dining hall, the VIP suites. Empty. Everything. Their phones were left on tables, unlocked. A woman's fur stole was draped over a chair, still slightly warm, like she'd vanished mid sentence. I raced up to the bridge. The steering wheel was tied down with thick rope. The throttle was locked, fixed at cruising speed, sailing us straight into the dark, empty ocean. In the ballroom, I noticed a knocked over centerpiece. Beneath the scattered roses, I found a small, perfectly carved wooden idol. It looked ancient, but it had a strange metallic sheen, like it had been dipped in liquid brass. When I touched it, it felt impossibly cold. I went back to the captain's quarters, determined to find some kind of explanation. There had to be one. I found the ship's electronic log. The last entries 4 hours ago detailed the boarding, then a sharp shift, approaching coordinates Alpha 7, followed by all non essential personnel to lower deck, and then a single horrifying line logged just minutes before I emerged from the closet. Deck pressure release. Active. I looked back at the dining hall. I realized the windows were all misted over on the inside with a thick, salty residue. I wiped a clean patch on the glass, and through the opening, I looked out over the black water, and I saw it. An impossibly large, dark shape passed beneath the waves, close enough that the yacht's white floodlights momentarily illuminated its surface. It was too flat, too structured to be a natural creature. I knew then that they hadn't been raptured, they had been sent. I remembered the lower deck command. I ran down 3 flights of stairs to the deepest part of the ship, the massive, watertight cargo bay. The main hatch was slightly ajar, but I forced it open. The bay was vast, but it wasn't full of cars. It was full of empty diving suits and specialized sealed circuit breathing apparatus. They hadn't panicked. They had prepared. I shone my phone light into the center of the bay, and there it was, the billionaire's most famous priceless antique. Hanging from the ceiling, secured by heavy chain, was an antique 8-foot tall bronze diving bell. Etched around its lower rim were the words, clearly visible under the grime, "To the depths." I looked down at the wooden idol in my hand. The metallic sheen wasn't steel, it was saltwater resistant bronze dust, the dust from this very bell. This wasn't a party, it was a pilgrimage. Thorn and his ultra rich guests had prepared for years for this ritualistic journey to become one with whatever ancient secret they found beneath the Vice City waves. And now I was alone, miles from shore. The yacht, locked on course, was sailing me directly toward their watery grave. The hum of the engine was no longer a sound of power, but the monotonous, deafening sound of my own execution. Before what transpired, I was just another broke freelance courier in Vice City, desperately scrambling for the next gig. That desperation is how I found myself taking the job from the guy in the alley, the one who wore mirrored sunglasses indoors. He paid me $10,000 cash up front just to deliver a single heavily encrypted hard drive to a tech studio downtown. He called it unreleased assets. He gave me one rule: don't look at the drive. The money was good enough to make me ignore the rule and everything else that felt wrong, but the moment the hard drive was in my passenger seat, the city started to break. It began with the small things, the stuff you blame on the heat or cheap infrastructure. I passed the same bright yellow taxi 3 times in a 5 block radius. I thought, okay, typical Vice City model recycling. Then the street signs started flashing the wrong textures, brief, digital smears of red and green pixels before correcting themselves. My radio static started sounding like coded Morse messages instead of white noise. But yesterday, the weirdness got a face. I was grabbing a greasy coffee when I saw him. A tall guy, neon yellow Hawaiian shirt, khaki shorts, and a sunburn that looked painful. He was standing perfectly still outside the coffee shop, staring at a discarded newspaper, a generic tourist. Harmless. 2 hours later, I was stuck in a monumental traffic snarl on the causeway. I looked out, frustrated, and there he was again. Yellow shirt, standing on the median, watching the ocean, not moving, not checking his phone, just static. That night, the obsession truly set in. I was trying to relax in my tiny apartment and I glanced in the cheap mirror by the door. Reflected in the glass across the street, standing perfectly vertical under a flickering street lamp, was the yellow shirt man. I went to the window. He was gone. I looked back at the mirror. He was still there in the reflection, frozen in time, a ghost in the glass. He was a persistent anomaly. I broke the rule I had to. I cracked the encryption on the hard drive. It wasn't game code. Not exactly. It was a file folder labeled pedestrian underscore assets. Inside was a single high resolution 3D model file. Its name was simply pad default mail B. I clicked the preview. The model that popped up on my screen was an unmistakable 3-dimensional blueprint of my stalker. Neon yellow shirt, khaki shorts, painful sunburn. I was carrying the source code of the thing that was hunting me. I decided I had to get rid of the drive immediately. I sped toward the drop-off location, a massive abandoned glass-fronted skyscraper downtown. When I screeched to a halt in the alley, the yellow shirt man was there, leaning against the steel door. He was waiting, but when I got within 10 feet, he simply evaporated, deleted. I scrambled inside, adrenaline pumping. The building was an echo chamber of concrete and dust, but in the center of the loading bay, a single monitor was flickering and one high-end PC was running. The screen displayed a simple 3D environment rendered in real time. It was a perfect wireframe replica of the exact alley I was standing in. A cursor was floating on the screen. I reached for my phone to call 911, but my screen was a mess. It was corrupted. The background was a broken texture file, and across the center of the display in huge white blocky text was a question. Restart mission? I dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, still displaying those two terrifying words. I stared at the monitor, mesmerized. The cursor was still hovering over the prompt. Then I heard a quiet shinning sound. The loading bay door was sealed shut. I turned around, and there he was, still. The yellow shirt man. He had returned, standing exactly where I had just been. He lifted a hand, a strangely blocky, low-poly hand, and rested it gently on my shoulder. I looked down at his hand, then at my own. My skin was starting to look strangely smooth, losing texture. My clothing seemed to blur at the edges. I wasn't the courier anymore. I was the protagonist. I was the asset. I heard the distinct, sharp click of the mouse. The cursor on the monitor had been activated. My vision, it went totally black. I went totally numb. A wave of compressed, synthesized data washed all over me. And then, you know what happened? Loud and cheerful, the sound of every desperate soul in this city knows. The game indeed is loading. So, welcome to Vice City.